Vance had been looking forward to his trip to London. It wasn't every day that a United States senator got invited to attend a high-level policy forum across the ocean. As his plane touched down at Heathrow Airport, he looked out the window with a sense of excitement. He had visited Europe before, but this was his first time visiting as a public figure representing his country. His schedule was full from the moment he arrived. Meetings with British officials, panels with fellow lawmakers, and evening dinners with international guests. Everywhere he went, people greeted him politely, always using formal titles and careful language. But British were different from what he was used to back home. But he found the formality kind of refreshing. His first full day in London was packed. After a quick breakfast at his hotel, he and his staff walked through the streets toward a historic government building called Lancaster House. It was just a short distance from Buckingham Palace, and the streets around it were filled with tourists snapping pictures and watching the famous royal guards. As they neared the courtyard, you noticed one of the royal guards standing completely still at his post. The guard wore the traditional red uniform and tall black hat. He stood as straight as a pole, not blinking, not smiling, not moving at all. Jid paused for a moment and watched him, clearly curious. "Wow," Jid said to his assistant. "They really don't move at all, do they?" His assistant smiled. "Not unless they're ordered to. They're trained to stay completely still." Jid chuckled. "You think he'd respond if I told him to move?" "Probably not," his assistant said carefully. But Jid wasn't really looking for advice. He was in a good mood, feeling confident, and wanted to have a little fun. He walked a bit closer to the guard, just a few steps, and raised his voice slightly. "At ease, soldier," Jid said with a grin. "Or at least give us a salute." His staff fell quiet. A few people nearby, including some tourists, looked over. There was a pause. The guard didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead, completely unbothered. Jid waited for a reaction. When none came, he looked over at his group and shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "Guess that doesn't work here," he said with a small smile. A few of his staff gave polite chuckles, but most of them stayed silent. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That's not how it works in the UK." Jid could feel the attention turning toward him. It wasn't anger or disrespect, just quiet confusion. He suddenly realized he might have crossed a line without meaning to. The moment passed quickly, but the lesson was just beginning. He was about to learn that in some places, tradition means more than a quick joke. Jid Vance stood there for a moment longer, unsure of what to do next. He had expected at least a small reaction from the guard. A nod, a blink, maybe even a smile. But the guard remained like a statue, completely still, as if Jid hadn't spoken at all. Behind him, a few tourists whispered quietly. Some looked amused, others confused. Jid shifted his weight and cleared his throat. It was a small moment, but something about it didn't sit right. He had made a light comment, just a bit of humor. But now it felt like he had misunderstood the setting. One of his staff members stepped closer and gently said, "Senator, they really don't respond. They're trained to ignore everything unless it's an emergency." She gave a short nod. "I see that now," he replied. They started walking again, leaving the motionless guard behind. Jid glanced over his shoulder once more. The guard hadn't moved an inch. He was still staring straight ahead, focused, calm, and completely silent. It was impressive, Jid had to admit. Different from how things worked back home, but impressive all the same. As they entered the courtyard of the nearby building, a well-dressed man approached them. He looked to be part of the British staff, tidy suit, name badge, and a calm but serious face. He greeted them politely and introduced himself as Mr. Ellis, one of the protocol officers for the event. "Senator Vance," Mr. Ellis said with a respectful tone. "Welcome. I hope your visit has been smooth so far." "Very smooth, thank you," Jid replied with a smile. Mr. Ellis hesitated for a second, then added, "I did want to mention something briefly. Our royal guards are ceremonial figures. They are not to be given commands or spoken to during their post. I understand it may have been meant in good humor, but they do not break form for anyone, not even visiting officials." Jid paused. The message was clear, but it was delivered in a kind, respectful way. He nodded. "Understood. I didn't mean any offense. Just a bit of culture shock on my part." "No offense taken," Mr. Ellis replied, his voice calm. "We simply like to maintain tradition. Our guards take their duty very seriously." "Clearly," Jid said, this time with real respect in his voice. The group moved forward into the building, where the rest of the day's meetings would take place. She had stayed quiet for a few minutes, thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't a major mistake, but it reminded him that even simple moments could carry meaning in another country. Every place had its own ways, its own rules. And here in London, standing still wasn't just a sign of silence. It was a symbol of discipline, of pride, of history. And maybe, Chip thought to himself, it was time to stop thinking like an American visitor and start observing like a guest. The next day, Vance's schedule was even more packed than before. After the small awkward moment with the royal guard, he decided to focus on his work. He had meetings with British lawmakers, discussions about transatlantic relations, and a few speeches to give. It was all business, and there was no room for distractions. As he walked into the conference room, he noticed the difference between how things were run in London and how they worked back home. Everything was organized, formal, and orderly. The people in the room were all dressed in sharp suits and dresses, standing up when others entered and leaving nothing to chance. It was the kind of environment where people valued respect, punctuality, and tradition. The meeting began with a brief introduction. He found himself sitting at a long table with other officials. The British were direct but respectful, and the conversation quickly turned to global issues, trade agreements, defense, and international cooperation. Zhu listened carefully, contributing when he had something important to add. He was a skilled speaker and could hold his own in any debate. But even so, something about the room made him feel a bit out of place. As the hours went by, Cheek tried to relax. He knew he had to adapt to the atmosphere in the room, so he leaned in, made eye contact, and nodded along with the conversation. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but think about the royal guard from the day before. The way the guard had remained perfectly still, no matter what was said or done around him. That guard was part of something much bigger than himself, she realized. It wasn't just about discipline. It was about history, pride, and the weight of tradition. During a break, Jid stepped outside to clear his mind. The sun was shining, and the streets of London were as busy as ever. He could hear the sounds of people talking, cars driving, and the distant murmur of the city. As he walked down the street, he saw another royal guard standing outside a nearby building. This one was positioned by the entrance, still as unmoving as the last. Chid paused for a moment, watching the guard. He thought back to his earlier mistake and smiled to himself. The silence, the stillness, it was something the British took seriously. It wasn't just about standing still. It was about showing respect for the tradition they held dear. Just then, a passerby smiled at Jade and said, "He's been standing there for hours. They're trained not to move, not even when people walk by." Jid chuckled. "I learned that the hard way yesterday." The passerby laughed, nodding knowingly. "It's all part of the tradition. They don't break form for anyone." Jid nodded in agreement. He understood now. Sometimes it wasn't about the rules you knew or didn't know. It was about respecting the ones that mattered to others. As he turned back toward the building, he felt a sense of humility. It was clear that this trip wasn't just about meetings or speeches. It was about learning, understanding, and growing in ways he hadn't expected. Today, he wasn't just an American senator in London. He was a guest, trying to understand a different world. As the days went on, Vance continued his work in London, but something had shifted inside him. The earlier experience with the Royal Guard, along with the lessons he had learned from the British traditions, stayed with him. He began to pay closer attention to the small details of the city, noticing things he might have overlooked before. It wasn't just about meetings and policies anymore. It was about understanding a culture that was different from his own. One afternoon, he found himself invited to a formal dinner with several British officials. The event was held in a grand room at a historic building near Westminster. It had high ceilings, large windows, and antique furniture that spoke of centuries of history. The dinner guests were dressed in evening wear, and the atmosphere was one of quiet elegance. Everything was carefully planned, from the silverware to the seating arrangement. Jid, now more aware of the importance of respecting local customs, made an effort to adapt. He stood when the host entered the room, followed the conversation carefully, and avoided making the same mistake with the royal guards. But as the evening went on, he found himself drawn into a deeper discussion with one of the British lawmakers. They talked about politics, of course, but also about history. The British lawmaker shared stories of London during World War II and the role of tradition in shaping modern society. She listened intently, fascinated by the way the British viewed their past and how much of it still influenced their present. At one point, the conversation turned to the topic of American and British relations. Ju spoke about the shared history of the two nations, the strong partnership between the United States and the United Kingdom. But then, in a rare moment of reflection, he admitted something he hadn't fully realized before. You know, Jude said, his voice thoughtful. Sometimes we Americans can be a little too quick to assume that everything should be like it is back home. We forget that other countries have their own history, their own ways of doing things. I think I've been guilty of that, even here in London. The British lawmaker smiled, nodding. It's understandable, he said. We all bring our own experiences and expectations when we visit new places. But it's also important to step back and observe, to see the world through others' eyes. She'd smiled in return, feeling a sense of gratitude for the insight. It was a humbling moment, one that made him realize how much he still had to learn. Not just about British politics, but about people in general. It wasn't just the guards or the formalities that mattered. It was the respect for tradition, for history, and for each other. As the dinner came to a close, She'd found himself reflecting on his time in London. He had come for the meetings, for the discussions, but now he was leaving with something more. He had learned that being a guest in another country wasn't just about showing up. It was about understanding, about respecting what mattered to others, and about growing through those experiences. The trip wasn't over, but it had already changed him in ways he hadn't expected. The days in London were beginning to blur together for Vance. The busy schedule, the meetings, the dinners, they all felt like part of a routine now. But what had started as a simple diplomatic trip had turned into something more personal. He found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned, not just from the formal events, but from the small, everyday moments. One morning, she had some free time before his next meeting. He decided to take a walk around the city to clear his mind. The streets of London were lively as usual, with people hurrying to work, tourists exploring, and street vendors selling everything from hot coffee to souvenirs. The weather was crisp, but the sun was out, casting a soft glow over the buildings. Jid wandered through some quiet streets, away from the crowds. He found himself near Hyde Park, one of London's most famous green spaces. He sat down on a bench near the edge of the park and watched as people jogged by, children played, and older couples strolled slowly down the path. There was something peaceful about the park, a calmness that seemed to surround everything. He thought about the Royal Guard again, the one he had tried to joke with. It seemed like such a small incident, but it had taught him something important. He had been so eager to make himself at home in a foreign country that he had forgotten to take a step back and truly observe. He had been too quick to assume that the rules he knew were the rules that applied everywhere. As he sat on the bench, he noticed a group of tourists nearby, laughing and taking photos. One of them was trying to get a picture with a statue of a famous British figure. The tour guide was patiently explaining the history behind the statue, pointing out details that most people wouldn't notice. She couldn't help but smile. It reminded him of how much there was to learn, even in the most familiar places. Sometimes it was easy to get caught up in the rush of things, to forget to look around and take in the details. Just then, a man sitting on a bench nearby looked up and smiled at Jid. He was older, with a gray beard and a kind face. They made eye contact for a moment before the man spoke. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice gentle. Jid smiled back. "No, I'm from the United States, just visiting for a few days." "Ah, I thought so. Not many people sit like that unless they're tourists," the man said with a laugh. "It's good to take a break sometimes, though, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," she agreed, nodding. "I've been so busy with work that I almost forgot what it's like to just pause for a moment." The man smiled knowingly. "It's easy to forget, especially when you're somewhere new. But I find that when you slow down, you see the world in a different way. You learn things you wouldn't have noticed otherwise." She had thought about the man's words. There was wisdom in them. Maybe it wasn't just about the work or the meetings. Maybe it was also about these quiet moments, the ones where you allowed yourself to just sit and observe. It was easy to rush through life, but it was in those pauses that the real lessons were found. After a while, Jude stood up, ready to continue his day. But as he walked back toward the busy streets, he felt a new sense of clarity. His time in London was more than just a trip. It was a reminder to slow down, to be present, and to truly understand the world around him. As the week came to an end, Vance's time in London was drawing to a close. The meetings were wrapping up and his official visit was almost over. He had learned a great deal, not just about politics, but about the city and its people. There was a sense of tradition and pride that ran deep in London. And though he had initially stumbled in his understanding, he now had a much greater appreciation for it. His final day in the city was marked by one last meeting at the British Parliament. She sat in a large, elegant room surrounded by politicians, advisors, and diplomats. The atmosphere was professional but also warm. They discussed pressing global issues, trade, security, and climate change, topics that required thoughtful debate. Jid spoke confidently, but there was a calmness in his approach, a new understanding that had developed over the course of the week. He was no longer just a visitor in a foreign land. He felt like a guest, someone who had taken the time to listen and learn. After the meeting, she found himself standing outside the Parliament building, the sun beginning to set behind the tall, historic structure. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool London air fill his lungs. The city was busy as ever, but there was a quiet energy now. People rushed by, some heading to work, others heading home. Tourists took pictures of the famous landmarks, and street performers played music, adding to the lively atmosphere. She walked down the steps and toward the riverbank. The Thames stretched out before him, reflecting the soft light of the setting sun. He had seen the river many times during his trip, but now it felt different. The water moved steadily, just as it always had, but it seemed to hold a quiet power, a reminder of the city's history and its resilience. As he stood by the river, he thought about everything he had experienced in London. The Royal Guard, the formal dinners, the long meetings. It had all been part of something much bigger than he had originally thought. It was about respect, history, and tradition. It was about recognizing that every place, every culture, had its own story to tell. She had pulled out his phone and checked the time. His flight home was in a few hours. He would be heading back to the United States, to his life in Ohio. But London had left a lasting impression on him. It wasn't just the beautiful buildings or the iconic landmarks. It was the people, the quiet pride they took in their history, and the respect they had for the traditions that had shaped their world. As he walked back toward the hotel, he made a promise to himself. The next time he visited a new country, he would take the time to listen, to understand, and to appreciate the things that made it unique. Because sometimes the real lessons weren't found in the big speeches or the official meetings. They were found in the quiet moments, like watching a royal guard stand perfectly still or listening to a stranger share their thoughts on life. Those were the moments that truly taught you something. And as Jid boarded his plane later that night, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the unexpected lessons he had learned in London. As Jid Vance returned to Ohio, he couldn't help but reflect on his time in London. The trip had been full of learning experiences, some expected and some not. He had gone there for work, to meet with lawmakers, discuss policies, and represent his country. But somewhere along the way, he had learned lessons that were not found in any meeting or speech. Back home, life returned to its usual pace. The meetings with local officials, the phone calls, and the endless piles of paperwork filled his days. But even in the busy routine of his work, London stayed with him. He thought often of the Royal Guard, standing still and silent, embodying the pride and history of the nation he had visited. He thought about the conversations he had had, especially the one with the older man in Hyde Park. Those moments had opened his eyes to how much he had to learn from the world beyond his own. One afternoon, Jid sat at his desk, going over a policy proposal. He could hear the sounds of the city outside his office window, cars passing, people talking, the usual hum of life. But as he read through the proposal, something in the back of his mind kept pulling his thoughts away. He remembered the quiet streets of London, the slow pace of life in some parts of the city, and how people there seemed to take time to appreciate what mattered. Jid had always been the kind of person who was focused on the end goal, pushing forward to accomplish what needed to be done. But now he found himself thinking about the importance of slowing down. The conversations he had in London had reminded him that there was value in taking a step back, in seeing the world through a different lens, and in giving time to the small details. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was his assistant, holding a few files. "Senator, I have the updates you asked for," she said, handing him the papers. Jid took the files, but before diving into the work, he paused for a moment. Sometimes I think we move too fast. We forget to stop and really understand what's going on around us." His assistant looked at him, slightly surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, in London, I saw how much people value tradition and history. They take their time to understand the bigger picture. We don't always do that here. We're always rushing to finish the next thing." She nodded, though she was still puzzled. Jid smiled and gestured for her to sit down. "It's just something I've been thinking about. Maybe there's something to be said for slowing down and seeing the bigger picture before charging ahead." His assistant thought for a moment before responding. Maybe you're right. But the work doesn't stop, does it? No, it never does, Jid said with a smile. But we can always find ways to balance it, to appreciate the moments in between. He looked out the window, the bustling city of Ohio before him. In that moment, he felt a little different. He had learned to take a step back, to look at things with a new perspective. And though life in Ohio was as busy as ever, he knew that he would approach it a little more thoughtfully from now on. The lessons from London had left their mark, and they were now part of the way he saw the world. As he turned back to his work, he couldn't help but feel that the journey of learning wasn't over. It had only just begun. Weeks passed since Vance's trip to London, and although life in Ohio had settled back into its familiar rhythm, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had changed in some small but important way. The lessons from London, the quiet moments, and the conversations about history and tradition were still with him. They lingered in the back of his mind as he went about his daily routine, guiding the way he approached both his work and his life. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a local university in Ohio. The event was a chance for students to ask questions about politics, public service, and the challenges facing the country. She had spoken at many such events before, but this time, as he prepared for his speech, he felt a sense of calm that had not been there before. He wasn't rushing to make a point or finish his speech quickly. Instead, he wanted to connect with the students to share what he had learned, not just about politics, but about life. The university auditorium was filled with students eager to hear what he had to say. They sat quietly as he walked up to the podium, and he noticed how attentive they were, hanging on every word. Jid smiled and began his speech, but this time, he didn't just focus on policy. He spoke about the importance of taking time to understand others, to appreciate the stories and traditions that shape people's lives. He shared his experience in London, how he had learned the value of slowing down, of taking a step back to see the bigger picture. Sometimes, he said, we get so caught up in our daily lives that we forget to truly understand the world around us. In London, I learned that tradition and respect for history can offer us valuable lessons. It's not just about moving forward quickly, it's about moving forward with purpose, with a sense of understanding. The students listened intently, many nodding in agreement. She could see that his words were resonating with them. It wasn't just the politics they cared about. They were hearing something deeper. The conversation shifted, with students asking questions not just about the country's challenges, but also about the role of tradition, patience, and understanding in leadership. After the event, he walked out of the auditorium, feeling a sense of fulfillment. He had gone there to teach, but in some ways, he felt like the students had taught him something too. They had reminded him of the importance of sharing what we learn, no matter how big or small the lesson. The world wasn't just about the work we did or the problems we solved. It was also about how we connected with each other, how we understood the different stories that made up the world. As he drove home that evening, he had thought about the journey he had been on, his trip to London, the quiet moments of reflection, and the conversations he had along the way had all led him to a deeper understanding of the world. And although his work was far from over, he felt a quiet confidence that he was on the right path, one that balanced action with reflection, progress with tradition. Jid knew that the lessons he had learned in London were just the beginning. There was still so much to understand, so much to learn. But he was no longer in a hurry. He had discovered the value of taking time, listening, and being open to new ideas. And that, he realized, was a lesson that would stay with him forever.